Let's not be so hungry for judgment that our hearts don't demand mercy. I want to end with a story from the Bible, if I could. What a moment. Everybody knows Jonah? Jonah and his whale. And most of us, we know that Jonah was supposed to go preach and he didn't want to, so he tried to go the other way and God threw him overboard and then a big fish swallowed him and then 3 days later the big fish threw him up. And so Jonah said, okay, if that's the way this is going to work, I'll go preach. And he preaches and everybody gets saved and then we move on to the next little book. And if that's what you know about Jonah, then you got the basics, but man, you missed the point. Let's review the basics. God says to Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh and I want you to preach. And here's the point we miss. Nineveh's cold, man. Nineveh's rough. They are not God's people. They're Gentiles. They don't belong in Abraham's covenant of promise. So first problem is they don't even deserve the gospel that God has given the Jews. Jesus hasn't died on a cross yet. I don't owe a Gentile a thing. And yet God says to Jonah, go preach to Nineveh. And when you get, and he doesn't even have to say this to him. He knows that Nineveh is a warrior nation. Nineveh would strip, I know we've got kids in the crowd, so I'm going to try to keep this as decent as you can and still bring the point across. Nineveh skinned their opponents alive. They used that skin to cover their furniture. They piled the skulls of their enemies outside of their city and they let them bleach in the sun as a mountain to tell you when you came into town who was boss. This is the first thing Jonah sees when he walks through the gate at Nineveh. The city is so big it takes 3 days to walk across it. Jonah tells God, I don't want to go to Nineveh, but he doesn't say why. We don't find out why until the 4th chapter. In the 4th chapter, what we find out is that Jonah says to God, God comes to Jonah. You say, well, what happened to the story? I'm going to go backwards to tell you because this is how the Bible does it. In chapter 4, God comes to Jonah and says, Jonah, why are you so mad? And Jonah says, because you did what I thought you would do. And God says, what did you think I would do? He said, I knew that if you sent me to Nineveh and I preached, you would move and they would repent. And when they repented, you would forgive them. And I don't want them to be forgiven. I want them to die. There's a good chance that someone in the Nineveh army had killed a member of his family. There's a good chance that he held a root of bitterness and hatred against Nineveh. And it's a really good chance that that's the reason God picked Jonah. So Jonah gets on a boat going the other way because I'm not going to Nineveh because I know how God is and I know what God does. And I know that God's not as quick to judge people as I am. In fact, I know that God is merciful and slow to anger. And he's so merciful and so slow, he'll actually forgive those Ninevites. And you know how we can keep that from happening? If they don't hear it, they can't get forgiveness. And so I'm going to get on a boat going the wrong way, and he does. And in the middle of you know the story, here comes a storm, and the soldiers who don't even know God cast lots and draw out a name, and lo and behold, it's Jonah. Then Jonah gets thrown overboard, swallowed by a whale, thinks he's dead forever. He even uses in the Hebrew vernacular, the bars of hell wrapped around me forever. He thought it was all over with. And then he wakes up on the shore of guess where? Nineveh. And covered in whale vomit and seaweed, he walks through the front gate in Nineveh, walks right past those skulls, walks right past that furniture covered in human skins, goes halfway through the city of Nineveh, stands in the middle of the town square, and preaches a God of forgiveness. And the end of the 3rd chapter says the Ninevites repented in sackcloth and ashes, and God had mercy on them. And Jonah walked outside the city and sat down on a hill and sulked. And that's where God comes and says, Jonah, why are you so mad? Jonah, Jonah, why are you so angry? Well, because, Lord, I knew you'd forgive him, and you did forgive him. And so God sends a tree in the middle of the night to grow up over the place where Jonah is sitting. And when Jonah wakes up the next morning, he's amazed because this is a huge tree full of shade, and it makes a very hot day feel very cool. And the 4th chapter of Jonah says Jonah relaxes and enjoys it. And then the next night, God sends a worm to kill his precious little tree. And the next morning when he wakes up, he's mad again. And the Lord comes back and says, are you mad about the tree, Jonah? This is amazing. See, I think we've missed this 4th chapter because we get all excited about the whale throwing him up and everybody gets saved. And we just act like there's only 3 chapters in Jonah. There's a 4th one. You can read it when you get home. And Jonah says, you bet I'm mad. He does. He says, you bet I'm mad. Now, and God says, why are you so mad about a tree you didn't have anything to do with? And you don't think I care for a people who I have everything to do with? 120,000 of which can't tell the difference between their left hand and their right hand. And then the book ends. What was God doing? God was saying to Jonah, now I like to say this, who don't know the difference in their left hand and their right hand? Little kids. I think God looks at Nineveh and sees a whole generation that's going to suffer. And God says, I can't have this. So go down there and preach to them. And Jonah does, and then gets mad. And to show Jonah that his anger is unsolicited, unwarranted, unnecessary, and unacceptable, God sends him a tree he didn't do a thing to get, and then takes it away and says, now how do you feel? You're mad about something you had nothing to do with. How do you think I feel about a people I lost in the garden? And I'm going to go to the ends of the earth to get them back. So let me ask you this. You mad about the way the world's going? You upset about a world you had nothing to do with? Well, what about doing something with the one you can, the kingdom that you have inside of you? And imagine a God that takes a look every day at the people he lost in the garden, and that he went to Calvary to get back, who can't tell the difference spiritually between their left hand and their right hand. And God says, you bet my wheels are going to be slow. You bet my mercy is going to be swift. Because my ways are higher than your ways. And my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And you may think you know grace, but you ain't seen nothing yet. Isn't our Father a good Father?